The night they dragged Clara Whitfield from her family's homestead and left her bleeding in the dark between two dead pine trees, something inside her broke so completely that even the stars felt like a threat. It was the autumn of 1873, and the Colorado Territory was not yet a state, not yet tamed, not yet the kind of place where a woman could feel the edges of her own life with any certainty. The Ute Pass Trail wound through the mountains like a scar, and the small settlement of Hatcher's Creek sat at the foot of the Rockies with about 40 souls who all knew each other's business, shared each other's grief, and occasionally looked the other way when powerful men did terrible things. The Doyle gang had been riding through those foothills for 2 years, taking what they wanted from whoever had the misfortune of being in their path. 3 brothers, Cole, Emmett, and Rufus Doyle, and 4 hired men who wore their cruelty the way other men wore their hats, casually and without apology. Clara had been 22 years old and living with her father, a former schoolteacher named Edwin Whitfield, when the Doyles rode through on a Thursday night in October. Edwin had tried to stand between his daughter and those men. He had not survived the attempt. Clara had run, barefoot through the darkness, until a blow caught the back of her head and the world went sideways and swallowed her whole. When she woke, the night was at its deepest, and she could not see anything at all. No moon, no lantern, no stars through the canopy of pine, and the darkness pressed against her like a living thing, heavy and suffocating, and she had screamed until her throat bled. A neighbor found her just after dawn, Abigail Crocker, 60 years old and hard as hickory, who had heard the screaming in her sleep and thought she had dreamed it until she heard it again. She wrapped Clara in a blanket and got her into town and sat with her for 3 days while Clara drifted in and out of something that was not quite sleep and not quite consciousness. When Clara finally came back to herself fully, she did not ask about her father. She already knew. She had known from the moment she woke in the dark. The sheriff, a man named Douglas Pratt, who was better suited to farming than law-keeping, did what he could, which was not much. He sent 2 riders after the Doyles, and they came back empty-handed. The Doyle boys had gone deeper into the mountains, someone said. Another person said they had crossed into Wyoming. The investigation, such as it was, dissolved like sugar in rain. Clara stayed with Abigail Crocker through the winter because she had nowhere else to go. The homestead had been burned, either by the Doyles themselves or by opportunists who followed in their wake. Her father's books, his spectacles, his worn leather Bible, all of it turned to ash. She had nothing but the clothes Abigail gave her and a hollow behind her sternum that the cold air moved through freely. The hardest part was the nights. Every single night, without exception, when the sun dropped below the ridgeline and the shadows began to pool and gather, Clara's breathing would change. It would become shallow and quick, like a trapped animal's, and her hands would tremble, and she would press herself into whatever corner was nearest and watch the dark as though it were something that could lunge. Abigail began leaving a candle burning on the windowsill of Clara's room, and that helped some, but not entirely, because a candle could gutter and die and leave you in the black, and Clara knew what the black held. By February, Abigail's second son and his new wife arrived from Kansas City to move into Abigail's house, and there simply was not room for everyone. It was said in the most gentle way possible, and Abigail held Clara's hands and cried real tears. But the fact remained. Clara needed to find another situation. It was Pastor Elias Vane who suggested Silas Colt. "He comes down the mountain twice a year for supplies," Elias explained, sitting across from Clara at the church table with a cup of coffee growing cold between his palms. "He's been asking after someone who might help keep his cabin in order and cook a proper meal while he's out working his trap lines. He's not a bad man, Clara. I've known him since he was 19 years old." Clara looked at the pastor over her own cup. "He lives alone up the mountain?" "Has for 6 years, since his wife passed." She was quiet for a moment. "How old is he?" 28, 29 by now. He's a decent man, honest, strong as an ox and twice as reliable. He won't trouble you." Elias paused and looked at his hands. "But I'll tell you plain, because you deserve honesty. It's a half-day's ride up into the high country. The nearest neighbor is 3 miles. It's isolated. If that feels wrong to you, say so and we'll find another arrangement." Clara thought about it for a long time. Isolated had once sounded frightening. Now it sounded like something else. The Doyle brothers had not come back through Hatcher's Creek, but there were rumors they were still somewhere in the territory, and the idea of being far from any road they might travel held a certain cold appeal. "When does he come down next?" she asked. "He came down in March, when the snow was still deep along the northern faces of the peaks, but the south-facing slopes had begun to breathe out their first pale green." Clara was in the pastor's parlor when she heard the horse outside, and she looked through the window and saw him swinging down from a bay mare, and her first thought, privately and with some embarrassment, was that he looked like something that had been carved from the mountain itself. Silas Colt was 6 feet and 2 inches tall, with shoulders that strained the seams of his canvas coat, and arms that had spent years hauling timber and setting traps and doing the 1,000 physical tasks that mountain life demanded. His hair was dark brown and grew past his collar in waves that had not seen a barber's scissors in months, and his jaw was covered in a close beard, neatly enough kept for a man who lived 3 miles from the nearest soul. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of someone who had learned long ago that excess movement in the high country wasted heat and energy. He was not graceful exactly, but he was deliberate, and there was a kind of quiet power in the way he carried himself that Clara found both unsettling and, against her own better judgment, steadying. He came inside and took off his hat and nodded to the pastor, and then looked at Clara. His eyes were the color of good wood smoke, a gray that tended sometimes toward blue, and they were set beneath brows that were currently drawn together in what she would learn was his habitual expression of careful attention. "Miss Whitfield," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried. "Mr. Colt," she replied. They sat across from each other at Pastor Vane's table, and Silas asked his questions with a directness that she appreciated, because it wasted nothing. He asked if she could cook, which she could. He asked if she was comfortable with horses, which she was well enough. He asked if she was planning to stay through the summer or whether she had other plans, and she told him truthfully that she had no other plans at present. He nodded at each answer like a man taking inventory. Then he said, "I heard what happened to your father. I'm sorry." And unlike most condolences she had received, which arrived wrapped in pity and a kind of horrified fascination, this one landed simply, without drama, as though he had offered her something real and was leaving it to her whether to pick it up. "Thank you," she said. "I want you to know what you'd be coming into," he continued. "The cabin is a 2-room structure. The sleeping quarters are private. I've got a curtained partition. You'd have full use of the main room. I'm out of the cabin before first light most days and not back until dusk or later, so you'd have the place largely to yourself. I don't have complicated needs. Hot food, clean gear, the stove kept going. In exchange, you'd have shelter, meals, and $4 a month." $4 a month was reasonable pay for a housekeeper in 1873, better than some. Clara agreed. She rode up the mountain with him 2 days later, her small bundle of belongings tied behind her saddle, and she watched the valley fall away beneath her as the trail wound higher and the pines grew older and taller and further apart. The air changed as they climbed, becoming thinner and sharper, scented with pine resin and cold water and something else she could not name, a mineral cleanness like the inside of a stone. The cabin sat in a small clearing on the eastern face of a granite ridge, with a creek running 40 yards below it and a view across the valley that, on a clear day, went for 50 miles. It was larger than she had expected, built from squared logs with a proper stone chimney and a covered porch. There was a small barn behind it, and a woodshed that was stacked high and neat, and a kitchen garden plot that was still sleeping under the last of the winter's frost. Silas helped her down from her horse and carried her bundle inside without being asked, and set it on the table, and then stood back and let her look around. It was clean, she noticed immediately. Not the clean of someone who had tidied up for her arrival, but the clean of someone who maintained things as a matter of habit. The floors were swept, the cook stove was blacked, the iron pots hung in order of size. There was a bookshelf along one wall with a dozen volumes, and a table and 2 chairs, and near the fireplace a larger chair with a leather cushion that was clearly his. Near the window, on a small wooden stand, sat an oil lantern. She did not think much of it at the time. The first week was a quiet negotiation of shared space. Silas rose before dawn every morning, made coffee with a practiced silence that suggested he had no desire to wake her, and was gone before the sun topped the eastern ridge. Clara would rise to find the coffee still warm on the back of the stove, and she would eat and then tend to the cabin and the garden plot and whatever else needed doing. By the time Silas returned in the evening, smelling of pine and cold air, and sometimes of blood from whatever he had taken on his trapline, she had supper on the table. They ate together because there was only one table, and at first the conversation was minimal. Practical exchanges about what needed to be done, whether the store of flour was running low, whether there had been any sign of the black bear that had been sniffing around the barn. But gradually, as March warmed incrementally toward April, they began to fill the silence with something more. She learned that he had come to the mountains at the age of 23 from Missouri, following a friend who had talked about the territory with evangelical enthusiasm, and then gone home to his mother after one winter. Silas had stayed. He had married a woman named Ruth 2 years later, a schoolteacher from a neighboring settlement who had loved the mountains with a fierce and genuine joy. Ruth had died of a fever in the summer of 1870, leaving him with a grief he had not spoken aloud to anyone since. He learned that Clara had grown up in Illinois, had come west with her father after her mother died of cholera, that Edwin Whitfield had believed in the territory with a scholar's romantic optimism that the land had not been entirely kind to, that Clara had been happy there, in a quiet way, before October. He did not ask her about the attack directly. She did not offer details. But one evening in the third week, sitting at the table after supper while the fire burned down, she said, "I don't sleep well in the dark." Silas looked up from the knife he was honing. "The dark itself?" he asked. No horror, no drama, just a question. "Since that night, I know it's not rational." He was quiet for a moment, thinking it through. "Fear doesn't usually wait for permission," he said. She looked at him, and he looked back, and something small and tentative passed between them that neither one of them had a name for yet. That night, she noticed that the oil lantern on the wooden stand near the window had been lit before Silas went to bed. A low flame, just high enough to cast a warm amber circle across the floor. She lay in her cot on her side of the curtain partition and watched the light move faintly under the gap at the bottom and felt her breathing slow. He said nothing about it in the morning. He simply made the coffee and left before dawn, as always. But that evening, when the sun went down and the cabin filled with shadow, she watched him cross to the lantern and light it with the same matter-of-fact ease with which he lit the cook stove, as though it were simply part of what needed to be done. It became the rhythm of their evenings. The sun fell, the lantern rose, and Clara began to trust the nights in a way she had not been able to since October. April arrived in a rush of snowmelt and birdsong, and the mountains began their slow, spectacular unfolding. The creek below the cabin swelled and sang over its rocks. The garden plot woke up. Silas brought her seedlings from a trading post on one of his supply runs, and she planted them with her hands in the cold dirt and felt, for the first time in months, something that resembled forward motion. One afternoon she was in the kitchen garden when she heard him come home early. Unusual, he was almost never back before dusk, and she straightened up to find him standing at the garden's edge, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. He had a bundle of wild columbines in his left hand, the deep blue kind that grew on the rocky slopes above the tree line, and he held them out with the same directness he brought to everything. "I passed a patch of them on the way down," he said. "They seemed like something you'd want." Clara took the flowers and looked at them for a moment and felt something squeeze painfully in her chest. Not hurt, but something adjacent to it, something made of tenderness and surprise and the particular ache of being seen by someone when you had spent months feeling invisible. "They're beautiful," she said. "Thank you, Silas." He nodded once, apparently satisfied, and went to put away his gear. She kept the columbines in a tin cup on the windowsill, and when they dried out she pressed them between the pages of one of his books. May brought visitors. A man named Harlan Webb rode up the mountain from Hatcher's Creek on a Tuesday afternoon to tell Silas that a trapper named George Oates had gone missing somewhere in the high country above the pass, and a party was forming to search for him. Silas listened to this with his arms crossed and his expression grave, and said he would ride out the following morning. Clara made an extra portion of supper and listened while Harlan Webb ate at their table and talked about the situation. Harlan was a friendly, talkative man of about 45, and he looked between Clara and Silas with the frank curiosity of someone who had been wondering about the arrangement. "You settling in all right up here, Miss Whitfield?" he asked. "Very well, thank you," she said. "It's lonesome country for a woman alone." "She's not alone," Silas said, and the simplicity of it landed so firmly that Harlan Webb nodded and changed the subject. Silas left before dawn the next day to join the search party. He was gone for 3 days, and those 3 days were the longest Clara had spent in the cabin alone, and she managed them well enough through the daylight hours. She worked the garden and mended clothes and cooked and cleaned and found that she liked the particular quality of the mountain silence, the way it was never fully silent but layered with wind and water and bird call. But the nights were hard. The first night without Silas, she sat in the cabin as the sun went down and felt the dark press in from the windows, and she lit the lantern herself, lit it before the light was even fully gone because she would not wait for the moment it failed. She kept it burning and sat close to it and read from one of his books, a battered copy of Washington Irving's sketches that she had read before and found comforting precisely because she had read it before. The second night was easier. She told herself firmly that she had managed the previous night and could manage this one too, and she lit the lantern and cooked herself a proper supper and ate it at the table and felt, if not exactly fine, then at least functional. The third night, Silas came home. She heard his horse on the trail just as she was starting supper, and she went to the door and saw him riding in through the last light of the evening, and the relief she felt was so large and so immediate that it startled her. She had not understood until that moment how much of her steadiness had been borrowed from his presence. That revelation was uncomfortable in the way that honest things often are. George Oates had been found alive, Silas told her, warming his hands at the stove. He had broken an ankle crossing a creek and had been sheltering under a ledge for 2 days before the party found him. He would heal. His wife had cried for the better part of an hour when they brought him in. "That's a relief," Clara said, and meant it. She set his supper on the table and sat across from him and watched him eat with the uncomplicated appreciation of a very hungry man, and thought about what she had discovered about herself in his absence and decided not to examine it too closely just yet. June came in warm and golden and smelling of pine pollen and new grass, and the mountains around them were so extravagantly beautiful that sometimes Clara would stop in the middle of whatever she was doing and simply look. The peaks above the tree line carried their permanent snowcaps like crowns, and the lower slopes blazed with wildflowers, Indian paintbrush in rust and orange, columbines in blue and white and yellow, the tiny white stars of mountain daisies scattered through the grass in the clearing. Silas began to come home earlier on the days when the weather was good. It was gradual enough that she almost didn't notice at first. He was a man of routine and purpose, and he did not change his habits carelessly. But she found him in the clearing more evenings than not, splitting wood or mending something on the barn, and after supper they began to sit on the porch in the last of the light and talk in a way that had moved well past practical exchange into something more personal and more real. He told her about Missouri, about the farm his father had worked himself nearly to death on, about the particular quality of freedom he had found in the mountains, a freedom that had cost him things he had not anticipated and that he did not regret. She told him about her mother, who had sung while she cooked and had never once in Clara's memory complained about anything harder than a sore foot. She told him about the books her father had read to her on winter evenings, about the way Edwin Whitfield had believed, with the stubborn optimism of a man who had chosen hope as a discipline, that education was the one thing the world could not take from you. "He would have liked you," she said one evening. "He respected capable men." Silas looked at her sideways. The evening light caught the angles of his face, the strong jaw, the broad forehead, the places where the sun had left its mark. "That's a generous thing to say." "It's a true thing," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking out over the valley. "Do you miss him every day?" "Yes," she said, "but it's changed since I've been here. It used to feel like a wound every single morning. Now it feels more like, I don't know how to put it, like a scar that aches in certain weather. He nodded, and she knew he understood that, knew it in a way that did not require explanation, and she was grateful for it. "Silas," she said, "can I ask you something?" "You can ask me anything." "The lantern," she said. "Every night. You never say anything about it. You just light it." He looked at her steadily. "You needed it. You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," he said, simply, as though this were as obvious as the mountain behind them, and he looked back out at the valley and said nothing further. And Clara sat with the warmth of that in her chest and thought that it might be one of the kindest things anyone had ever said to her. It was in July that things changed, and changed in the way that they change when two people have been circling a truth for long enough that the circling itself becomes exhausting. It started with a storm. The summer storms that came off the Rockies in July were not subtle. They built through the afternoon in towers of cloud so dark they looked almost green, and they arrived with thunder that reverberated off the granite faces of the peaks and rattled the windows in their frames. And they brought lightning that turned the night sky white and then black again in a way that was both magnificent and terrifying. Clara had grown more accustomed to the nights. The lantern helped enormously. Silas's steadiness helped more. But storm nights were still difficult. This one came in fast, faster than expected, and caught Silas 3 miles from the cabin on the upper trapline. Clara was inside when the sky turned, and she watched through the window as the storm front swept down the valley with the speed and authority of something that owned the mountains and was merely tolerating the presence of human beings in them. The thunder hit first, enormous and rolling, and she backed away from the window instinctively, her heart hammering. She lit the lantern. She lit every candle she had. She stoked the fire high. She sat at the table with her hands flat on the wood and told herself to breathe, to count, to think about the thickness of those log walls and the solidity of the stone chimney, to remember that she had survived a real darkness, and this was only weather. But the lightning kept coming, and each flash turned the lantern light to nothing and drowned everything in a blazing white that reminded her, involuntarily and without her permission, of how complete the darkness after each flash had been, and how the darkness in October had felt exactly like this, absolute and sudden and swallowing. She was still sitting at the table, rigid and pale, when the door opened and Silas came in on a rush of rain-cold air and thunder. He was soaked through. His hair was plastered to his face, and his canvas coat was dark with water, and he was breathing hard from whatever pace he had kept to get back. He took one look at her across the cabin and crossed the room in 4 strides and pulled her to her feet and wrapped both arms around her, and it was the most natural thing, the most inevitable thing, as though neither of them had made a choice at all but had simply arrived at a destination that had been waiting for them. Clara pressed her face against his chest and felt the solidity of him and breathed, and the shaking in her hands slowly stopped. He held her for a long time, one hand at the back of her head, one arm around her shoulders, and the storm raged outside and the lantern held its light, and neither of them spoke for a while. "I rode hard to get back," he said eventually. His voice was rough. "I know," she said. "I didn't like the idea of you here alone in it." She pulled back enough to look up at him. His gray-blue eyes were serious, and there was something in them that was not quite restrained, not quite hidden, not quite the neutral steadiness she had come to expect from him. "Silas," she said. "Clara," he said. And then he kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not the kiss of a man who was asking a question or testing water. It was the kiss of a man who had been thinking about it for long enough that the thinking had made him certain, and it was gentle despite its certainty, and it was warm despite the cold rain on his coat. And when he lifted his head and looked at her, she felt as though the floor had shifted slightly, as though the whole of the previous 4 months had rearranged itself around this single moment and made sense of it. "I've been wanting to do that for a while," he said. "I know," she said. "So have I." Something changed in his face. Not dramatically. Silas was not a dramatic man, but it changed in the way that a landscape changes when the sun comes out. The same hills and trees and rocks suddenly lit in a way they had not been a moment before. He tucked a strand of wet hair back from her face with one large hand, and looked at her with a directness that made her feel both seen and completely safe. "I need you to know something," he said. I don't come at things sideways. I'm not built for it. What I feel straight through. I've been trying not to complicate your situation here, because you came to me needing something solid to stand on, and I didn't want to be one more thing you had to worry about. But if you're willing—" "Silas," she said. "Yes." "Stop talking," she said, and kissed him back. The storm lasted through the night and spent itself sometime near dawn, and they sat by the fire while it finished, close together, talking in the way of people who have decided to know each other fully and are discovering how pleasant the project is. He told her things he had told no one else, about the nights after Ruth died, about the particular brand of solitude that had saved him, and then slowly begun to hollow him out, about the way the mountain could be so many things at once, shelter and wilderness, comfort and indifferent enormity. She told him about the months after the attack with a plainness that surprised her, not the facts, which she had recounted before, but the interior of it, the way the dark had taken on a texture of its own, the way she could not step into an unlit room without her body doing something her mind had not decided. She told him how much the lantern had meant to her, not just the light itself, but the fact of it, the fact that he had understood without being told and had simply, quietly, done something about it. His jaw tightened when she talked about the Doyle brothers, and she felt the tension in his arm where it rested against hers. "The sheriff hasn't followed up," she said. "I know," Silas said. "I went down and spoke to Pratt myself in the spring." She looked at him, surprised. "You did?" "He said he'd sent word to the territorial marshal. I don't know if that's true or whether he just wanted me out of his office." His voice was even, but there was something underneath it, controlled and dense. "I told him that if it turned out he'd done nothing, I would be back." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I don't want you doing anything that would put you in danger." "I know you don't," he said, "but I'm not the kind of man who can know what happened to you and your father and do nothing at all. That's just the way I'm made." She understood that. She did not argue it. She rested her head against his shoulder and watched the fire and thought that she had not felt this safe in a very long time. Not just the physical safety of strong walls and a reliable man nearby, but the deeper safety of being with someone who was willing to know all of you and stay anyway. August swelled golden and enormous around them. Clara's garden was producing abundantly, beans and squash and beets and late-season greens, and she had started helping Silas preserve and store food for the winter months, learning the rhythms of high-country housekeeping with a willingness that surprised even her. She had not known before this that she had a capacity for this kind of life. She had thought of herself as her father's daughter, better with books than with root cellars. But there was something about the specific combination of the mountains and the work and the man that made everything feel purposeful in a way she had not expected. Silas began teaching her things. He taught her to read the weather by the behavior of the birds and the color of the evening sky and the way the wind moved in the trees. He taught her to shoot, standing behind her on the porch with his arms around her to correct her aim, which they both pretended was purely instructional, and which neither of them entirely believed. He taught her to read the trapping maps he kept in a leather-bound book, the hand-drawn lines that showed the creeks and ridges and game trails of his territory. And he told her the names he had given to places, the meadow he called Ruth's Garden, because Ruth had loved it, a ridge he called the Cathedral, because the tallest pines there grew in a formation that reminded him of a church, a stretch of creek he called the Loud Part, because that was simply what it was. She loved the names. She loved the way the map held his years in the mountains, the accumulated knowledge of someone who had chosen to understand a place rather than simply inhabit it. She gave him things too, though she thought of them as smaller. She read to him in the evenings, from his own books first, and then from the small collection her father had pressed into Abigail Crocker's hands before everything happened, which Abigail had kept, and which Harlan Webb had brought up on a supply visit, wordlessly and with a significant look that Clara had been grateful for. She talked about ideas in a way that Silas engaged with seriously, his head tilted and his eyes thoughtful, offering his own observations with a dry precision that she found consistently surprising and increasingly delightful. He was not educated in the formal sense, but his mind was sharp and curious, and entirely unafraid of a complicated idea. One evening in late August, he came home with a piece of news that changed the shape of things. He had been down to the trading post at the bottom of the mountain for supplies, and while he was there, he had spoken to a man passing through from the north, a freighter who moved goods between settlements and heard a great deal in the process. The freighter had told him that the Doyle gang had been caught. Clara set down the spoon she was holding. "When?" she asked. "Last month, it sounds like. Cole Doyle and two of the others tried to rob a stage north of Denver. There was a deputy U.S. Marshal riding inside, and they didn't know it. Cole and one of the others were shot. The third was captured and is in custody in Denver." Silas set his supply bags on the table and looked at her steadily. Emmett and Rufus were picked up separately in Cheyenne on an unrelated charge that turned into something more. The freighter said they'd be tried. Clara stood at the stove for a long moment without speaking. She did not feel what she had imagined she would feel. She had imagined something dramatic, fury or relief, or the particular catharsis that she had heard could come when justice arrived. Instead, she felt something quieter and more complicated, like a door closing on a room she had lived in for too long. The room had been dark and full of grief and fear, and the door closing on it was good, unquestionably good, but it was also the closing of something, and closings had their own weight. "Cole is dead," she said. "Yes. And the others will be tried." "That's what the man said. He seemed reliable." She nodded slowly. She picked up the spoon again. She stirred the pot that did not need stirring because she needed something to do with her hands. "Are you all right?" Silas asked. His voice was careful, giving her room. "I think I am," she said. "I think I will be. I'm—" She stopped and started again. "My father deserved better. He deserved to see justice himself, to see it done proper, and I'll always be angry about that. But I'm glad they can't hurt anyone else." Silas came and stood beside her and put his hand over hers on the spoon handle, stilling it. "Your father knew you were safe," he said. "I think, wherever people go, that's what they want to know, that the ones they love are safe." Clara turned her face toward his shoulder and held herself very still for a moment while something old and heavy moved through her and shifted its position, not gone, but differently arranged. "He would have liked you," she said again. "I mean that even more than I did the first time." "That's a good thing to hear," Silas said softly. September came in clean and cool, the aspens beginning their slow turn to gold, and with September came a development that neither of them had planned, but both of them had perhaps been moving toward with the slow and inevitable momentum of water finding its way downhill. Silas asked her to marry him on a Tuesday evening in the first week of September. They had finished supper, and he had sat across from her for a long moment with his hands flat on the table, looking like a man who was gathering himself, and she had waited, knowing something was coming by the particular quality of his stillness. "I've been trying to find the right way to say this," he said, "and I've concluded there isn't a right way, there's just a true way." "Then say it true," she said. "I want you to stay," he said, "not as a housekeeper, as my wife. I want to build things with you, Clara. I want the winter and the spring and all the seasons after it. I want to keep the lantern lit for you every night for the rest of my life. I want to be the kind of man your father would have thought was worthy of you. And I know I'm not there yet, but I intend to keep trying." He paused. "I love you. I've been in love with you since sometime around April, I think, and I haven't been able to get the better of it." Clara looked at him across the table for a long moment, at the broad, honest face and the steady gray-blue eyes and the hands that were so capable of work and so unexpectedly gentle, and she thought about what it meant to be in the right place, not just physically but inwardly, in the deepest sense, and how rare that was and how completely she felt it now. "Yes," she said. "Silas, yes." He let out a breath that told her he had not been entirely certain of her answer, which moved her more than it would have if he had been confident, because it meant that his certainty about his own feelings had not made him arrogant about hers, and that was exactly the kind of man he was, and she loved him for it fiercely. They were married in October, 1 year almost to the day after the worst night of Clara's life. Pastor Elias Vane rode up the mountain for the occasion, accompanied by Abigail Crocker, who dressed in her best wool dress and cried through the entire ceremony with the open enthusiasm of someone who considered herself personally responsible for the outcome. Harlan Webb came and brought his wife, and George Oates, fully recovered from his broken ankle, came with his wife and a jar of honey from his bees. The small gathering stood in the clearing in front of the cabin under a sky of such profound autumn blue that it seemed almost impossible, the aspens around them blazing gold and orange, and the peaks above carrying the first fresh snow of the season. Clara wore a dress of dark blue wool that Abigail had helped her make over the previous weeks, and she carried the dried columbines that Silas had brought her in April, tied with a piece of ribbon. She had not planned this sentimental detail. It had simply seemed right. The ceremony was simple and short and utterly serious. When Pastor Vane asked if she took this man, she said yes with a firmness that made Abigail cry harder and made Silas's mouth curve in that particular way he had, just one corner, a smile that was small and private and entirely genuine. When it was done, and the ring, a plain gold band that Silas had traded for in Hatcher's Creek, with a formality that had apparently impressed the jeweler, was on her finger, he held her hands for a moment and looked at her, and she looked at him, and there was a whole world in it. The supper that followed was loud and cheerful and full of Abigail's stories, which were voluminous and entertaining, and occasionally made Clara's face go red with laughter. George Oates played a harmonica with competent enthusiasm. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey. The fire burned high, and the lantern sat lit in the window, and the mountain night was full of stars and cold and the clean sound of the creek below. Abigail hugged Clara hard before she rode down in the morning. "He loves you the way good men love," she said, "with everything he has and no reservation. Don't you ever take that lightly." "I won't," Clara said. "Abigail, thank you for everything you did for me." Abigail patted her face and climbed onto her horse and rode away down the trail, and Clara stood in the clearing and watched her go, and felt gratitude move through her in a wave so large it was almost like grief, which was how profound thankfulness sometimes felt. Their first winter together was a revelation. Clara had spent the previous winter at Abigail's house in a settlement, with the particular insulation from weather that proximity to other people provided. This winter was different. The first snow came in November, and it came seriously, and by December, the mountain was transformed into something that was either terrible or magnificent, depending entirely on your interior landscape. The trail down was impassable for weeks at a time. The wind came off the high peaks with a force that made the cabin walls breathe. The temperature dropped to places that the thermometer on the porch registered with apparent reluctance, and Clara found, to her considerable surprise, that she was not afraid. She was not afraid of the cold or the isolation or the vast white silence. She was not afraid of the way the darkness came so early in December, the way the sun cleared the southern ridge for only a few hours each day, and the rest was night. She was not afraid because every single evening, without exception, as the light failed and the dark came in, Silas lit the lantern. He never forgot. He never came in too tired or too cold or too distracted to do it. In 12 months of living with her, he had not missed a single night. She had never had to ask him, had never had to remind him, had never once woken in the night to darkness. The lantern was always there, its amber light holding steady on its wooden stand by the window, a small, unwavering argument against the dark that said, simply and without rhetoric, "You are not alone here, you are safe here. The dark knows the limits of this room." One December night, lying awake and watching the lantern's light move on the ceiling while the wind worked at the cabin walls, Clara thought about what it meant to be loved in the specific ways that a specific person needed. Not in a generalized, abstract way, not the love that announced itself and then left you to figure out its practical application, but in the daily, practical, specific way. The way that said, "I noticed what you needed, and I provided it, not because it was impressive to do so, but because you needed it, and I could." She turned and looked at Silas asleep beside her, the large, warm solidity of him, the slow rise and fall of his breathing, the jaw going slack in sleep in a way it never did when he was awake. And she thought that she had not known, before October 2 years ago, that she was capable of this depth of feeling. She had been, in her previous life, a warm and reasonably happy person, but not an intense one. The attack had done something terrible to her, and it had also, in a way she found impossible to celebrate but could at least acknowledge, stripped away the comfortable insulation between her and the fact of things, and made her available to the full weight of her own life in a way she had not been before. The full weight of her own life, right now, was very good. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind and the creak of the logs and the distant sound of the creek below, still moving even under its cap of ice, and went to sleep. The winter passed in the slow, particular way of mountain winters, marked not by the calendar so much as by internal changes, the gradual deepening of the cold, the stillness that fell over the high country when the temperatures dropped to their floor and even the animals went quiet. And then, barely perceptibly at first, the shift the other way, the lengthening of the afternoons, the particular quality of the February sun that was different from January's, less theoretical, more present. Silas spent the worst of the winter months doing the work that the cold season permitted, mending gear, building a second workbench for the barn, reading and talking with Clara in the long evenings with a mutual satisfaction that neither of them had the words for precisely, but that both of them felt as something whole and sufficient. He had never been a man who had much use for idle conversation, but he had discovered, apparently, that conversation with Clara was not idle in any way that bothered him, and he had been generous with it in a way that told her how much he trusted her with the inside of his mind. By February, she told him she thought she might be pregnant. He was at the workbench when she said it, fitting a new handle to a trap, and he went very still with his hands on the wood and looked up at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, not the calm steadiness or the private small smile or the focused concentration of physical work, but something raw and immediate and almost undone. "You think?" he said. I think," she said. "I'll know more in another few weeks. But I think." He crossed the space between them in 2 strides and held her face in his hands and looked at her, and then kissed her forehead, and then held her against him for a long moment without saying anything, and she felt against her hair what she thought might have been something very close to a shudder in those enormous, steady shoulders. How are you feeling about it?" he asked. "Terrified," she said honestly, "and very, very happy." "Good," he said. His voice was unsteady. "That's about where I am, too." By March it was confirmed. By April she was unmistakably, visibly expecting, and when Harlan Webb came up the mountain on a supply run and saw her standing in the kitchen garden, he went back down to Hatcher's Creek and apparently told everyone within a 3-mile radius, because they received 3 congratulatory visitors in the following week, including Pastor Vane and Abigail Crocker, who brought a blanket she had been knitting since approximately January, suggesting that she had suspected before they had told anyone. "I had a feeling," Abigail said serenely when Clara pointed this out. The spring and summer of 1875 were the most quietly extraordinary period of Clara's life. She worked the garden and preserved food and read and talked and grew larger and slower and more absorbed in the project of becoming a mother with every passing week. Silas adjusted to her changing needs with his characteristic lack of drama. He took on more of the physical work without comment, made sure she was comfortable, brought home small things that he thought might please her, a new book from the Trading Post, a bunch of late-season wildflowers, a piece of soft wool he had traded for because he thought it would make a good blanket. She caught him once, in the early summer, sitting at the table with a scrap of paper and a pencil, doing something with careful concentration. When she looked over his shoulder, she saw he was drawing a plan for an addition to the cabin, a 3rd room off the main structure with a small separate fireplace. "When did you plan this?" she asked. "February," he said. She put her hand on his shoulder and he covered it with his without looking up from the drawing, and she stood there reading his plans over his head and thinking that she had married a man who planned for the future with the same quiet thoroughness with which he did everything else, and that she had been extraordinarily lucky. The baby came in November. It was not an easy labor. Clara would be honest about that with herself and later with the women who asked. It was a night and most of a day, and it was harder work than anything she had done with her hands in the mountains, and Silas sat outside the bedroom curtain for the duration, with his elbows on his knees and his head bowed in an attitude that was either prayer or something very much like it, while the midwife from Hatcher's Creek, who had ridden up in the morning, worked and waited and occasionally said reassuring things that he did not find reassuring. but at the end of it was a son, a large and healthy son with enormous lungs and dark hair. And when the midwife carried him out and put him in Silas's arms, Silas sat very still and looked at this person for a long moment with an expression that Clara, watching from the doorway where she was leaning against the frame in a state of complete exhaustion, thought was the most naked thing she had ever seen on a human face. Pure, unguarded love. No walls, no restraint, no mountain man stoicism, just a man looking at his child. "Clara," he said, and his voice had nothing in it that it usually had. "I know," she said. They named him Edwin Silas Colt, Edwin for her father. The name felt right, felt like a small ceremony, a carrying forward of something that deserved to be carried. Eddie, as he became almost immediately, was a good baby by most standards, which primarily meant he slept in stretches long enough to be survivable and cried for reasons that were usually discoverable. He had Silas's gray-blue eyes, which were remarkable in an infant, and Clara's mouth, and an overall disposition of alert curiosity that manifested, from the very earliest weeks, as an unblinking watchfulness that amused and slightly unnerved them both. That first winter with Eddie was different from the first winter together, which had itself been different from every winter before. The cabin was warmer in the important sense, not in temperature, but in density of life. The new room was not yet finished. Silas would complete it before the following winter, but the main room held the three of them easily and well, and in the evenings Silas would sit with Eddie in his large chair by the fire, while Clara read or sewed or simply sat watching them both, and the scene had a completeness to it that seemed sometimes almost too much, as though this much goodness in one room was a quantity that needed to be handled with some care. The lantern was still lit every night. Eddie slept through it, indifferent to the light. Clara still needed it, though less desperately than before. The fear had diminished over the years to something smaller and more manageable, more like a scar than a wound, precisely as she had described it to Silas on the porch in that first summer. But the lantern was lit nonetheless, and she thought she would probably always need it, and she had made her peace with that, and so had Silas, long ago and completely. The spring of 1876 brought the completion of the new room and a visit from a stranger who turned out to be no stranger at all. He arrived on the trail in May, a man of about 50 in a good coat, riding a well-kept chestnut horse and carrying himself with the authority of someone who was accustomed to being in charge of things. He introduced himself as Thomas Whitfield, her father's younger brother, whom Clara had not seen since she was 12 years old and who had spent the intervening decade in San Francisco in the shipping trade. He had heard what had happened to Edwin from a letter Clara had sent to the family address years ago, not expecting an answer and not receiving one until now. Thomas Whitfield had apparently spent a long time not answering, and then one day gotten on a horse and started east. Clara stood on the porch and looked at her uncle, and saw her father in the set of his jaw and the color of his hair, which was going gray in the same places Edwin's had been. And the meeting was complicated and emotional, and went on for most of the day and into the evening. Thomas met Silas with the wariness of a man assessing another man's worthiness for a job that was already done. And Silas met this assessment with his customary directness, answering Thomas's questions plainly and not ingratiating himself with false warmth. By supper, Thomas had apparently arrived at a favorable conclusion, because he was less watchful and more present, and after the meal he held Eddie with an expression of surprised delight, as though a grandchild-adjacent figure were not what he had come expecting and was better than he deserved. He stayed for a week. When he left with a standing invitation to return and a promise to write, both of which he honored. The correspondence with her uncle became one of the small, bright threads in the fabric of Clara's life, his letters arriving 2 or 3 times a year, full of San Francisco news and the occasional philosophical observation that reminded her of her father so acutely she had to put the letter down for a moment before she could continue. The summer of 1876 was the summer Colorado became a state. They heard the news from Harlan Webb, who rode up the mountain with particular excitement to deliver it, as though the official designation of statehood would change their daily lives in some material way, which it would not, but which meant something regardless. Clara and Silas sat on the porch that evening and talked about what it meant, about the territory becoming something with formal edges and a name on the national map, and Silas said, in his measured way, that he hoped the formal edges would be kinder to the people who had been living in the territory long before it was a territory, which it probably would not be, because that was not the pattern of things, but that hoping was not useless. He was right about the pattern. The years that followed the statehood brought increased settlement and increased tension along lines that had been present for decades and were not improved by the formality of borders. Silas and Clara were not directly involved in the violence that played out further west and north, but they were not entirely removed from it either. And Silas, who traded and dealt and had long relationships with several Ute families who worked the high country, came home from certain supply runs with a grimness about him that he wore for days. Clara did not push him to talk about it before he was ready, because she had learned that his processing happened on its own timeline, and that her job was to be present when he arrived at words, which he always eventually did. "It's not right," he said once, sitting at the table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, not looking at anything in particular. "Pushing people off country they've lived on longer than any of us have been here, calling it progress." "No," she agreed, "it's not right. I don't know what to do about it. I can trade fair, I can deal honest, I can speak up when I see something wrong, but I can't." He shook his head. "There's a lot I can't do." "Do what you can," she said. "Your father told you that, didn't you? About the farm?" He looked up. He did. "Then do what you can," she said, "and let the doing of it mean something." He looked at her for a long moment and then nodded, and reached across the table and took her hand, and she held it back, and the fire burned, and Eddie slept in the new room, and the lantern sat lit in its place by the window. The years settled into themselves. Eddie grew from an infant to a toddler, to a small and opinionated boy who had his father's eyes and his grandfather's curiosity and his mother's stubborn streak, which manifested primarily as an extraordinary resistance to bedtime and a talent for asking questions at the most inconvenient possible moments. He was tireless and fascinated by everything, by the creek and the birds and the tools in his father's barn and the books on his mother's shelf. And watching Silas with him was one of Clara's private pleasures, the way the large man and the small boy moved through the world together, Silas answering every question with the same careful honesty he brought to everything, crouching down to Eddie's eye level without apparent self-consciousness, teaching him the names of things with the patience of someone who understood that names were a form of respect. By 1878, Clara was expecting again. This second pregnancy was easier in ways and harder in others. Easier because she knew what to expect. Harder because she was also managing a 3-year-old and a household and the endless physical demands of mountain life. And the tiredness was a different and more persistent kind. But she was healthy and the baby was healthy, and the midwife, who had moved up to a proper settlement not far down the mountain and was easier to reach now, came and went with approving frequency. The second baby arrived in July, in the full heart of summer, with considerably less drama than the first. A girl this time, compact and fierce and red-faced with the effort of arriving, and indisputably loud. They named her Ruth Margaret Colt. Ruth for Silas's first wife, because Clara had suggested it and meant it with genuine generosity, because Ruth had been loved and deserved to be remembered, and because Clara had no fear of ghosts who had been loved well. Margaret for no one specific. It was simply a name that suited her, a solid and reliable name for a person who was already in her first hours, suggesting that she would be solid and reliable, and also perhaps quite a lot to handle. Silas held her with the same quality of stillness he had held Eddie, and Eddie pressed close against his father's knee and looked at his new sister with an expression of deep suspicion that gradually, over the following weeks, converted itself into a proprietary affection that expressed itself primarily as a desire to show her everything he considered important, including various rocks, a collection of bird feathers, and the spot by the creek where he had once seen an otter. Ruth was not in a position to appreciate these gifts for some time, but she arrived at appreciation eventually, and by the time she was walking, she followed her brother with a devoted attention that Eddie found alternately flattering and maddening, which was the natural order of things. The cabin had grown with them. Silas had added 2 more rooms over the years, with the kind of methodical competence that he brought to all structural projects, and what had been a 2-room trapper's cabin when Clara first came up the mountain was now a proper home, with a separate bedroom for the children and a covered porch that ran the full length of the front, and a spring house and a proper well that Silas had dug in the summer of 1877. The kitchen garden had expanded substantially, and Clara had added a small orchard of apple and plum trees that were only now, in 1878, beginning to bear in earnest. Life on the mountain had its rhythms and its difficulties and its unexpected gifts. There were hard winters and there were abundant summers. There were years when the trapping was poor and years when it was good. There were illnesses, nothing, thank God, that crossed into tragedy, but the ordinary fevers and chills and injuries of physical life in a physical place that kept them both perpetually aware of the body's vulnerability. There were the large and small sorrows that accumulated in any life. The news, in 1877, that Abigail Crocker had died peacefully in her sleep at an age she herself had estimated at somewhere around 75. The departure of Pastor Vane for a parish in Denver that same year. The gradual changes in Hatcher's Creek as more families arrived and the settlement grew into something that called itself a town and had the beginnings of a proper main street. Clara rode down to town more regularly now than she had in the early years. Not from any change in her feeling about the mountain. She loved the mountain with a devotion that had only grown over the years, but because the children made connections, made friendships, made a life that extended beyond the cabin and the creek and the clearing. She sat on the school board when Hatcher's Creek finally established a school in 1879. She contributed to the efforts to build a proper library, which she felt was the kind of cause worth any inconvenience. She was known in the town as Mrs. Colt from the mountain, which she wore with some amusement, as though the mountain were a surname Silas had given her along with his own. Silas came into town less often, but with more weight when he did. He had built the kind of reputation that was worth more than money in mountain country, a man whose word was absolute, who dealt fair, who helped when help was needed without requiring acknowledgement. When a family lost their home in a fire in the spring of 1879, Silas spent 3 weeks helping them rebuild. He did not make a production of it. He simply came with his tools and worked, and the other men of the community came too, because he was there, because it was the thing that was needed, because that was how things worked in a country where you could not afford to be indifferent to your neighbor's survival. Clara watched him across the fire at the communal suppers during those weeks and thought that she'd been lucky in her life in 2 distinct ways that intersected in this man. She had been lucky to survive the worst thing that had ever happened to her, and she had been lucky to be given, by that surviving, the chance to arrive at a life that was exactly the right size and shape for who she actually was. The trial of Emmett and Rufus Doyle had concluded in 1874, before Eddie was born, though Clara had not known about it until months later, when a report reached Hatcher's Creek through a Denver newspaper that Harlan Webb brought up the mountain. Both men had received sentences that would keep them incarcerated for a very long time, long enough that she would not have to think about them unless she chose to, which she did not particularly choose to. The territorial judge had been thorough, and others had come forward with accounts of what the Doyle gang had done in other places, and the weight of it had been sufficient to serve the law in a way that Douglas Pratt alone had been incapable of achieving. She had read the report twice, and then put it in the fire, not out of anger, but out of the particular necessity of closing a door that she was done going through. Silas had watched her do it without comment. "Are you all right?" he had asked when the paper was gone. "Yes," she had said. "I genuinely am." He had nodded and said nothing further and kissed her temple and gone back to what he was doing, because he understood that some conclusions were complete and did not need elaboration. The year 1880 came in with a fine, cold clarity. Eddie was 5 years old now, and full of the kind of energy that required constant management and occasional strategic redirection. Ruth was 2, and had apparently decided that her primary purpose was to be as different from Eddie as was physically possible, which expressed itself as a serene and watchful stillness that fooled you right up until the moment she made her move, which was always unexpected and usually involved something being climbed or taken apart. Clara stood at the window of the cabin on the first morning of the new year with a cup of coffee in her hands and watched Silas in the clearing below, splitting wood in the sharp cold with his sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the temperature, the axe swinging in clean arcs, each split log dropping away from the blade with a satisfying crack. He was 35 years old now and built even more solidly than when she had first seen him swinging down from his bay mare in front of Pastor Vane's house. The years of physical labor had only compounded what nature had supplied, and the hair at his temples had begun to carry the first silver threads, and she thought he was more beautiful to her now than he had been then, because she knew what was behind it, every line of work and grief and joy and steadiness that had made him. He looked up and saw her in the window and lifted his chin in acknowledgement, and she lifted her coffee cup, and across the cold morning air something passed between them that was comfortable and particular, and entirely theirs. Eddie came up behind her and pressed his face against the window glass to watch his father work, fogging it with his breath, and Clara put her arm around him and held him against her side, and Ruth came stumbling out of the children's room in her nightgown, with her dark hair disordered and her expression indicating that she was awake and had opinions about it, and the morning opened around them like a hand. That afternoon, when the wood was split and stacked and the children had worn themselves out with some elaborate game in the clearing that had involved most of their toys and at least one bucket of snow, Silas came inside and sat at the table and looked at Clara with an expression she had come to recognize over the years as the precursor to something important. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know," she said, sitting across from him. "You've had that look for a few days." A corner of his mouth moved. "What look?" "The one where you're carrying something around before you're ready to say it." He acknowledged this with a small nod. "I want to expand the trap line north," he said. "There's country above the pass I've had my eye on for a couple of years. It would mean 3, maybe 4 days away from the cabin at a stretch, come trapping season." Clara considered this. How would that work, with the family? "That's what I've been thinking about," he said. "I don't want to leave you and the children for that stretch without someone closer. Harlan Webb's boy James is 19 now, good with horses and reliable. I was thinking about asking him to stay here when I'm on the extended runs. Give him a little wage for the time. He'd bunk in the barn." Clara thought about this. James Webb was a quiet and capable young man who had been up to help with various projects and whom she trusted well enough. "That could work," she said. "And I want to put it to you honestly," Silas continued. "If it troubles you, if the additional time away doesn't feel right, I'll put the idea aside. The trap line we have now is sufficient. It's not a necessity." Clara looked at him. He meant it. She had known for years that he meant it when he said things like this, that they were not the formalities of a man seeking permission, but the genuine offering of a man who considered her judgment and comfort genuinely relevant to his own decisions. "Try it for 1 season," she said. "We'll see how it goes and decide from there." He nodded. He reached across the table and took her hand in the way he had always had, briefly and firmly, a gesture so habitual it had become almost a punctuation mark, the period at the end of a decided thing. James Webb came to stay for the first extended run in November, arriving with his gear and a shy politeness and a genuine affection for Eddie that expressed itself as a willingness to spend 2 hours one afternoon demonstrating rope tricks, which Eddie considered the greatest educational experience of his young life. Ruth observed the rope tricks from a safe distance with an expression of scientific interest. The arrangement worked. Silas came back from the northern trap line 4 days later with a haul that justified the effort and an animation about him that told Clara the new country was everything he had hoped. And over supper, he described the terrain with the specific enthusiasm he reserved for landscape, and Clara listened and asked questions and felt the particular pleasure of watching someone she loved encounter something that genuinely delighted them. The winters continued to be beautiful and brutal and entirely worth it. In the spring of 1882, Clara's Uncle Thomas visited for the second time, older now and silver-haired, having sold his shipping concern and being in the process of deciding what to do with the remaining years of his life. He stayed for 2 weeks this time and took long walks with Silas and long conversations with Clara and played with the grandchildren he had apparently decided to treat as such, regardless of the technicality that they were great niece and nephew. On his last evening, sitting on the porch in the April dark with a blanket over his knees and a glass of whiskey in his hand, he looked at Clara and said, "Your father would be very proud of you. I want you to know I believe that with everything I have." Clara looked at the stars over the mountains and felt the old ache and the old comfort of it, the scar that changed with the weather. "I know," she said. "Thank you, Thomas." He patted her hand. Inside, they could hear Silas reading to the children, his low voice steady and even through the log wall, Eddie demanding to know what happened next, Ruth making a sound that might have been a question or might have been the beginning of sleep. Thomas looked in the direction of the voices and smiled. "He's a good man," he said. "The best I've known," Clara said without qualification. The years after that moved with the speed that years develop once a life finds its proper shape. They are not slower or faster, not easier or harder, but they have a different quality, a texture of accumulation, of layers laid down one upon another, each one adding to the depth of the whole. Eddie started school in town when he was 6, riding down with Clara 3 days a week in good weather and staying home for lessons she gave him the other days. He was, as she had anticipated, his grandfather's grandchild, driven by questions, not satisfied with partial answers, capable of following a single idea down a long and winding road and emerging at the other end with something new. He was also, as she had not anticipated but probably should have, his father's son in ways that had nothing to do with academics. He was already, at 7, developing the particular quality of physical patience that Silas had, the ability to be still and wait and watch before moving. Ruth was her own thing entirely, which Clara suspected Ruth would always be. She was quiet and observant and mechanically gifted in a way that surprised and delighted Silas, who began teaching her at 4 years old how things were put together by the simple expedient of letting her watch everything he did and answering her questions. By 5, she was helping him make small repairs in the barn with focused competence. By 6, she had opinions about the design of the new cold storage he was building, and at least one of her opinions was correct, which Silas incorporated into the design without making a point of it, simply because it was the better approach. The lantern was still lit every night. Clara no longer needed it with the desperate necessity of the first years, but she had never told Silas to stop, and he had never offered to. It had become, over the years, something that was simply part of their evenings, as natural as supper and as reliable as the mountain itself. The amber light on the wooden stand by the window had been the first thing she had looked for on the first morning she woke up in his cabin, and it was the last thing she saw every night before sleep, and somewhere along the way it had become less about fear and more about love, a small daily act of devotion as habitual as breathing, as fundamental as the choice to stay. She told him this one evening in their room, lying in the comfortable dark that was no longer frightening, watching the lantern's light move on the ceiling. "The lantern," she said. "I want you to know what it has meant to me, not just in the beginning when I needed it, but now. Still now." Silas was quiet for a moment. She felt him turn his head toward her in the dark. "It started because you needed it," he said. "It stayed because it's yours, because you're here. And I want to know every night that you're safe, and the light is how I do that. That's not going to change." "You've lit it every single night since I came up this mountain," she said. "I intend to keep doing it," he said, as though this were the most obvious thing in the world, which to him it was. She found his hand under the blanket and held it, and he held it back, and the mountains settled around them in the dark, vast and cold and permanent, and the lantern burned steadily in its place. The summer of 1884 was the summer of the extraordinary thunderstorm. It came in July, as the big storms always did, but this one was different in scale from any they had seen before, a 3-day weather event that the old-timers in Hatcher's Creek would reference for the next 20 years as a fixed point of comparison. The lightning was almost continuous on the second night, and the thunder was the kind that you felt in your chest before you heard it, and the rain came down with a force that turned the creek into a churning brown torrent and overtopped its banks and sent water across the clearing in a sheet that lapped at the lower step of the porch. Clara stood at the window and watched it with Silas beside her and Eddie on one side and Ruth on the other, and she felt the old small pulse of the old fear, the way the lightning blanked the world and then left the dark rushing in. But it was small now, manageable, a physical memory rather than a consuming present. She breathed through it, and the lantern was lit behind her, and Silas's arm was around her shoulders, and the cabin held. "That's a very big storm," Eddie said, with the particular tone of a 9-year-old who is trying to be appropriately impressed without appearing frightened. "It is," Silas agreed, "and this cabin has stood through 30 years of storms and is going to stand through this one without any help from us." Ruth, who had been watching the lightning with pure scientific interest and no apparent distress, said, "Is the barn all right?" "I checked the barn an hour ago," Silas said. "The animals are fine." Ruth nodded, satisfied. Then she turned from the window and went back to the book she had been reading. Clara watched her daughter go and felt a fierce and complicated love for the specific person she was, the practicality, the calm, the internal sufficiency that was all her own. Eddie stayed at the window for a few more minutes, watching with his father. Clara moved to put the kettle on and make tea, because the storm had brought the cold in, and tea was the appropriate response to cold. And as she moved around the kitchen, she listened to Silas and Eddie talking in low voices about weather patterns and barometric pressure, and the way the mountains created their own climate systems, Eddie asking questions and Silas answering them, and the whole scene had the quality of something she would want to keep, she knew, in the particular interior archive that the best moments go into. The storm ended on the third day and left behind it a world that was washed and dripping and smelling of wet pine and fresh earth, the creek still running high and loud and the clearing littered with small branches and one large one from the old pine at the clearing's edge that had finally given way. The sky that emerged was the deep and brilliant blue of post-storm high country sky, and the sunlight had the clean quality of something that had been thoroughly rinsed. Silas walked the perimeter of the property with both children to assess any damage, a ritual he had after every significant storm, and Clara watched them from the porch, the three of them moving through the dripping trees, Silas's broad shoulders above the children's heads, Eddie talking without apparent pause, Ruth crouching to examine something in the mud. The family she had not known she was going to have, and the place she had not known was home, with the man she had not known existed until she needed him most. She pressed her hand against the porch rail and let herself feel the fullness of it, which she had learned over the years was something you had to let yourself do deliberately, because ordinary life had a way of moving too fast for gratitude if you did not occasionally stop and insist on it. In the fall of that year, Clara began a project she had been thinking about for a long time. She had always written, privately, in the journals she had kept since childhood and continued through her years on the mountain, but the project she had in mind was different. She had been thinking about the women who came west, the ones whose stories were not being written down anywhere, who arrived in the territory out of necessity or choice or both, and stayed and built and endured and found something in the hard country that the easier places had not provided them. She thought about Abigail Crocker, who had wrapped a frightened young woman in a blanket in the gray dawn and saved her life with simple human kindness. She thought about Ruth, who had loved the mountains with a fierce joy. She thought about George Oates's wife, who had waited with a steady face for days, not knowing if her husband was alive. She thought about the Ute women she had occasionally seen in the trading post, dignified and watchful, living in a country that was increasingly being shaped by people who did not consider their presence relevant. She began to write these stories. She wrote them carefully and honestly, and with the specific understanding that truth was the only thing worth bothering with. She wrote at the kitchen table in the mornings when the children were occupied, filling pages in her clear schoolgirl hand, and she showed them to no one for the first year except Silas, who read them on a Sunday evening by the fire and said nothing for a long time and then said, "These are important. Don't put them in a drawer." She didn't. She sent 3 of them, at Silas's steady urging, to a newspaper in Denver that had occasionally published pieces about life in the territory, and they were printed, and the editor wrote back asking for more. It was a small beginning, but it was a beginning, and she held it with both hands. 1886 arrived with a sense that the world was changing, even up in the high country where change came more slowly and with more consideration. The railroad had reached deeper into Colorado by then, and the character of the territory was shifting in ways that were sometimes exciting and sometimes troubling, and were always, at root, about the question of what progress meant and who got to benefit from it. Silas watched these changes with his characteristic thoughtfulness, and talked about them with Clara with a depth of engagement that she valued enormously, because he saw clearly and spoke plainly, and did not confuse the fact of change with the virtue of it. Eddie was 11 now, and had the kind of mind that was going to need more than what even an excellent mother could provide at the kitchen table, and they had begun to discuss the question of his education with some seriousness. There was a proper school in Hatcher's Creek that he attended with consistency, and his teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Haley, had written to Clara explicitly to say that Eddie had capacities that deserved cultivation beyond what she could offer, and that she would consider it a professional obligation to help the Colts identify appropriate next steps. Ruth was 8 and had recently disassembled the kitchen clock and reassembled it correctly on her first attempt, which Silas had regarded with a composed pride that he had then expressed by teaching her how to properly oil a mechanism, which Ruth had absorbed with a satisfaction that was almost audible. Clara and Silas talked one evening about the years ahead, the practical architecture of it, the question of school for Eddie, the question of what the mountain meant and would continue to mean as the children grew, the question of what they wanted and what they hoped for and how it all connected. "I don't want to leave the mountain," Clara said. "I want to be very clear about that." "I know," Silas said. "But I also want Eddie to have every door open to him, and Ruth." "So do I." He was quiet for a moment, looking into the fire. "There are ways to do both. He could board in town for the school year, come home on weekends when the weather allows. It's been done. And it would break both our hearts for the first few months." "Probably," he agreed, "but most things worth doing involve a period of that." She looked at him and thought of the woman who had ridden up this mountain in March of 1874, with nothing but a small bundle and a hollow behind her sternum, and of everything that had been built since then. The rooms added one by one, the garden, the orchard, the children, the years, the thousands of lit evenings. And she felt the specific courage of someone who has survived a great darkness, and knows, from that surviving, that she can survive ordinary difficulty without flinching. "All right," she said, "we'll start making arrangements in the spring." He reached across and took her hand. She held it back. The fire crackled and the lantern cast its amber light from the window stand, and the mountain held them in its enormous patient dark. The years went on, as years do when a life is built well, not without difficulty, not without the sorrows that no life avoids, but with a quality of foundation that meant every hard thing had something solid to push against. Eddie began boarding in Hatcher's Creek for the school year when he was 12, and came home on weekends with mud on his boots and new ideas in his head and an undiminished delight in the specific quality of the mountain air after a week of town air. Ruth began her formal schooling with a focus that her teacher described as formidable, and her parents described privately as entirely expected. Silas continued his trap lines and his trading and his careful stewardship of the piece of mountain that was his particular territory, and he remained the man he had always been, honest and capable and steady as granite, quick to help and slow to anger, and possessed of a loyalty that once given was given without conditions. He had lines around his eyes now from the years of squinting into high-altitude sun, and the silver in his hair had spread from the temples through the hole, and he wore it well in the way that physically large men often do, as though the gray were simply a further element of substance. Clara looked at him sometimes, across the table or the clearing or the crowded benches of the church they now attended in Hatcher's Creek on most Sundays, and felt the same thing she had felt in those first months, that curious combination of steadiness and sensation, of safety and aliveness. That was the specific texture of being loved by someone who knew you entirely and chose you anyway, every day, with the same intentionality with which he lit the lantern, which he still did. Every night, without fail, through all the years, the lantern was lit before dark fell completely. It was their unspoken covenant, their nightly reaffirmation of the particular thing that had begun between them on those early evenings in the cabin when she had been frightened and broken, and he had been wordlessly, completely present. It was the gesture that had grown into love and then become absorbed by love, the way tributaries are absorbed by rivers. Eddie came home for the summer of 1889, changed in the way that 16-year-olds are changed, all angles and opinions, and a new gravity about him that coexisted with sudden helpless moments of being very much still a boy. He had been working with a surveying party in the summers, carrying equipment and learning the precise language of land measurement, and he was passionate about it with the seriousness of someone who had found a direction. "I want to study engineering," he told them over supper one evening, with the directness of his father and the vocabulary of his mother. "Proper engineering. There's a college in Boulder." Silas put down his fork and looked at his son. "Tell me about it," he said. Eddie told him about it. Clara watched Silas listen, the careful attention, the intelligent questions, the way he was already working through the practical architecture of how this could be done, and felt a love for him so large and so familiar that it barely registered as emotion anymore, had become more like weather, the element she lived inside. They worked it out. They always worked it out. Ruth, at 13, had by this point declared an interest in mechanisms and structures that went beyond the kitchen clock and several subsequent mechanical projects, and had found in Miss Haley's replacement a Mr. Gaines who taught the older students at the Hatcher's Creek School, a teacher who took her seriously and gave her books on engineering and mathematics that she consumed with a focused intensity that was something to see. "She's going to do something remarkable," Silas said one evening after they had received a letter from Mr. Gaines with effusive praise for Ruth's aptitude. "She's already doing something remarkable," Clara said. "She's being exactly who she is, against a great deal of circumstance that would prefer she be someone else." He looked at her. "She gets that from you." "She gets it from both of us," Clara said. "She gets the stubbornness from me and the patience to do something with it from you." He laughed, a full, unguarded laugh that she still loved after all the years of it, and reached across the table to touch her face, briefly and firmly, the same way he had always had. And she turned her face against his hand and thought that some things improved over time to an extent that should not logically be possible. And yet here they were. The new decade arrived, and with it a Colorado that was changing rapidly, the silver boom and the ranching boom and the railroad shaping a state that was nothing like the territory it had been when Clara had ridden up the mountain for the first time. Hatcher's Creek had grown into a proper town of several hundred people, with a hotel and a newspaper and a doctor's office and a women's civic society that Clara had helped found, and which concerned itself primarily with the school library and secondarily with the conditions in the county jail, about which there was much to concern yourself. Silas had expanded his operations north as planned, and had also, over the years, moved into timber contracting when the trap lines were slower, providing cut timber to the building trade that was doing a brisk business in the growing towns of the high country. He was not wealthy in any conventional sense, but they were comfortable, which was a different and in some respects more durable kind of security. Their life on the mountain continued. The cabin had grown into a house, properly speaking, with 5 rooms and a full covered porch, and a barn that would not embarrass a proper rancher, and the orchard that had been bearing generously for over a decade. The creek still ran below, and the peaks still carried their permanent snow, and the clearing was still the clearing, still bounded by the same old pines, a few of which had begun to show their great age and lean very slightly, as ancient trees lean toward the patient earth. On a November evening in 1891, Clara and Silas sat on the porch in the last of the light, cold, properly cold, the first hard frost of the season already silvering the clearing, and Silas lit the lantern as the dark came in, as he always did, the small flame catching and steadying and casting its amber circle on the porch boards, and Clara watched him do it and thought about 17 years. 17 years since she had come up the mountain with a small bundle and a hollow behind her sternum. 17 years of this clearing and this light and this man. 17 years of making something out of what had been left after the worst night of her life. Eddie was 19 and at the Colorado School of Mines in Golden, writing letters home that were alternately enthusiastic and exhausted, full of the specific experience of being somewhere you have always wanted to be, and finding it exactly as hard as worth it. Ruth was 15 and had spent the summer with a machinist in Hatcher's Creek, learning things that no one had thought to teach a girl before, and learning them better than anyone else he had ever taught, which the machinist had the grace to admit openly and the wit to be proud of. The world was changing and would keep changing, and their children were in it, fully and on their own terms, which was everything parents could ask. "What are you thinking?" Silas asked. His voice was low in the cold evening air. "About all of it," Clara said. "About where we started and where we are. About how much has happened in this clearing." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the valley. The mountains against the darkening sky were enormous and serene, and entirely indifferent to the smallness of human life, which was, she had come to understand, one of their gifts, the way they put your own story in proportion without diminishing it. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "That first night when I noticed the lantern, when I understood that you had just lit it without saying anything, just because I needed it, that was the moment. I think I knew from that moment what kind of man you were. I didn't know yet what I felt about you, but I knew what you were, and I understood that it was something rare." She paused. "And every night since then, every single night you've lit it, it has said the same thing to me, without words. It has said, 'I see you and I'm here, and you're safe.' And I want you to know that I have heard it. Every single night for 17 years, I have heard it." Silas did not look at her for a moment. He looked out at the valley and the dark coming in from the east. And when he did turn to her, his face had the quality she had first seen when she told him she thought she was expecting Eddie, the raw, unguarded quality of a man who has no defense against his own feeling and has decided not to construct one. "I'll keep saying it," he said. "I know," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his shoulder, and the lantern burned between them, and the mountain dark came in around the light and stopped at its edges, as dark had always stopped at the edges of wherever he was, because that was who he was, a man who understood that some things needed keeping and kept them with the same unhesitating consistency with which he drew breath. They sat there until the cold drove them inside, and then they went inside together, and he was careful to carry the lantern in from the porch and set it on its stand by the window, because the stand by the window was its place, and had been its place for 17 years, and would be its place for all the years that followed. And when Clara lay down that night and looked at the lantern's steady light, she felt what she had felt every night since the beginning, not just safety, but home, not just light, but love, and she closed her eyes in the amber glow of it and slept without fear. Outside, the mountain held its ancient silence, vast and cold and full of stars, and the wind moved through the pines in the clearing, and the creek ran over its rocks in the dark below, and in the window of the house on the ridge. The lantern burned, as it always burned, steady and golden and unwavering, a small, particular flame against the enormous dark, lit by a man who had understood from the very beginning that love was not a feeling you announced, but a thing you did, every day, in the specific ways the specific person needed, without ceremony, without condition, without fail. And the dark, as it always had, kept to its side of the light.